Welcome to Massachusetts versus EPA. During this court case, 19 organizations and states fought the EPA to regulate the emission of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. It all started many years ago with the Clean Air and Water Act of 1962. Section 202 of the Clean Air and Water Act said that the EPA must regulate any emissions from pollutants that endanger public health. It also said that the emission of pollutants from motor vehicles should be regulated. Then, in 2003, a group of 19 organizations and states petitioned the EPA so that it would regulate the emission of CO2 and other greenhouse gases from newly created automobiles. They said that they should consider CO2 under the Clean Air and Water Act as the threat of global warming posed a threat to public health. The EPA refused, saying that it did not have the jurisdiction to do so. In 2005, the petitioners brought the case to the Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. The EPA was backed by 6 automobile organizations as well as many states. The petitioners presented their case showing how global warming was being caused by CO2 and other greenhouse gases. However, the Court of Appeals ruled in favor of the EPA. The court said that the petitioners lacked standing and that they were not able to show how the CO2 emissions were actually causing them any harm. However, the judges granted certiorari, which meant it could be revisited by the Supreme Court. In order for the petitioners to prove that they had standing, they had to show how the EPA not regulating greenhouse gases was actually causing them harm. Before the petitioners appealed, they first had to address the problems stated by the Court of Appeals so that they could have success in the Supreme Court. First, the petitioners had to prove that they had statutory standing. To do this, they had to show that the release of CO2 emissions from automobiles was causing harm to a specific state. To do this, the petitioners chose Massachusetts to represent them, as global warming would cause the Massachusetts coastline to be lost. The petitioners submitted scientific evidence to prove the toxicity of carbon dioxide and how it was causing global warming. Finally, the case went to the Supreme Court. Massachusetts was represented by their Attorney General, Martha Coakley, while the EPA was represented by Gary Gurur. The court was extremely divided during this case. Massachusetts was presented scientific evidence showing that global warming was causing rising sea levels, which was taking their land. This proved that they had sufficient standing, as they were able to link how the EPA failing to regulate CO2 emissions was causing them both actual and imminent harm. This proved that carbon dioxide was causing them harm, which means it fell under the Clean Air and Water Act. However, Chief Justice Roberts would dissent. Chief Justice Roberts said that Massachusetts' scientific connection was purely speculative and that they did not have standing in the first place. He said that domestic motor vehicle emissions only accounted for 4% of CO2 emissions, and any regulation would not make a big enough difference. Even after Chief Justice Roberts' dissent, the court still ruled 5-4 in favor of Massachusetts, saying that the EPA had the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from newly created automobiles. They also said that greenhouse gases, like CO2, fell under the Clean Air and Water Act, meaning the EPA would have to regulate them. The court decided that the definition of a pollutant under the Clean Air and Water Act was so broad that CO2 and other greenhouse gases must be regulated under the EPA. The EPA would try and fight this in later cases, but would end up failing. This ruling would be very important in other cases related to the emission of greenhouse gases, such as NRDC versus the EPA. In this case, the court proved that states can challenge the authority of federal agencies and that injury is a requirement for standing. As a result of this case, the EPA was forced to review the effect of greenhouse gases on public health. This led to the creation of the common sense limits, which established limits on the pollution discharged from tailpipes, smokestacks, and oil and gas development activities.